All right. Hopefully I can edit that. My name is Jeff Atkins. I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University, and my talk today, I'm going to talk about the ecological importance of forest structural complexity. So, as any good talk in ecology, I want to start off with a bunch of catty old white men who monopolized the scientific discussion for a few decades, and in the process shaped, kind of the early and really, in some ways, still the current discussion about what structure is within forests. So this quote comes from an early review of Frederick Clemens's book, The Plant Succession, written by Henry Cowles. Clemens treats the formation as an organism with structures and functions like an individual plant, greater stress placed on development and less on habitat, although many workers, especially in Europe, will continue to emphasize habitat as a controlling factor in classification. So in Clemens's book, he's writing about how an ecosystem forms, that's formation, right? So he's really talking about plant succession. But here, Cowles is drawing a clear line in how, kind of this American crowd, led by Clemens, differs in their thinking from kind of those in Europe. And so even there's another quote from Arthur Tansley in review of Clemens's work that Cowles mentions. It says, in a review of Clemens's work by Tansley, it is shown that it would be very difficult to apply to England the idea that succession is always progressive. So this clear line, he's shown that the Clemensian view and the American view on forest structure is one that is and will, during the first half of the 20th century, be dominated by this idea of succession, development, and climax communities. That structure is always something that you strive towards. Forests and ecosystems are always progressing towards some ideal state or the climax community of whatever that given location is. Now, I think it's certainly possible that one could read into this some ecological version of manifest destiny. However, for this talk, I think it's kind of useful for us to really focus on a different idea of perspective. What shaped this view of forest structure and structural development? So the predominant issue of studying forest in the early 1900s was actually, in the US at least, the severe lack of forest. At the turn of the century, America was a country that was undergoing the process of industrialization still, and it was largely fueled by resource extraction and utilization, including those of forest. After America was colonized by white Europeans, the following 3 centuries were spent steadily clear-cutting and harvesting forest, moving progressively westward. In these pictures here, you can see in the upper left corner and the upper right, show Pennsylvania and Colorado after being clear-cut around the turn of the century. In the one in Pennsylvania here, we can see some burn scars, and the one in the upper right in Colorado, we actually see some erosion caused by this deforestation. In the lower right here, this is taken atop Cabin Mountain in West Virginia. In the far distance there, you can actually see the field site that I used for my PhD. Here, in large parts of along Cabin Mountain and Canaan Valley, after clear cut, the forest fires were so intense that it actually burned the soil away completely. And here you can see, some relic stumps, but also just exposed Tuscaroran sandstone. In the lower right here, we can see large swaths of northern Michigan. This is also clear cut. And so, honestly, it's no wonder that if you're an American ecologist, succession was the predominant driver of what you were studying. It became the focus. This is the focus all the time because it was right there in front of you. So this debate, though, between Americans and Europeans was really kind of interesting. And it reminds me of this story that Bill Bryson writes about in one of his books about how early English scientists did not understand the concept of glaciers. Talking about Agassiz' theory about how glaciers shape the landscape, building from these ideas of geology. Robert Murchison once said, "Could the scratches and the polish just be due to ice?" And he called these glaciologists and geologists ice mad. And in part, this was really because Murchison had never really left England. And so if you had never really left England, then you never really had a concept of what a glacier was like, right? There wasn't technology around to actually see that. So his concept of what ice was simply just ice that would form on rocks, like rime ice or something, right? And so he could not possibly imagine that things like erratic boulders could be placed somewhere by ice. That seemed absolutely ludicrous to him at the time. And well, we certainly can laugh about that quote, and there's many other ones actually from, mocking the ice mad geologist. The point is that it's the perspective of that was ill-informed for various reasons. So what I wanted to do, because I do have a deep love of history and, in a way, textual analysis, is I took some very early works, from Clements and Richards and Gleason and Tansley and these folks who early on shaped the idea of what forest ecology and succession and structure were, and threw this into a textual analysis where it points out a word cloud. And so the size of the word corresponds to the frequency that it's used in these texts. So what's kind of interesting with this is, one, there's not that many really gigantic words. There's a few that kind of pop out: community, vegetation, forest, association, habitat, and there's lots of small words. So in part, as Bob Fahey pointed out when looking at this, was that these guys were just really wordy. But also, besides that, because they were really wordy, is that in a way, this shows a lack of cohesion about what we're talking about. All of the texts that were put in here to analyze really talked about forest structure, how forests are built, and understanding forests. And so there's a lot of different viewpoints coming on. So these are the leaders in the field at the time, and there's not a cohesion of thought that's moving forward. There's this talk of the species, of associations, developments, and etc. But in part, the first half of last century, ecologists were at best creating this nascent understanding of ecosystems and how they're structured. And they're trying to actively build this language to talk about, structure and forest. They're building the theories. And so in a way, literature kind of informs that, right? So we have two things going on. We have a field kind of forming, but we also have this viewpoint based on the systems around us, right? This is the bias that's informing this. This is this ecosystems that are in front of them. We're really focused on this concept that structure is something that's built over time. Time equals structure, which isn't wrong, right? But even by the end of that first half of the century, Alex Watt and Pattern and Process define structure that at any given time, therefore, structure is the resultant of causes which make for order and those that tend to upset it. So again, we still kind of have this idea that structure is something we're working towards, right? I think it's ironic in a way that this is called Pattern and Process, but really good piece, but it's pointing still kind of in this vein of something we're building to, which we should know what, not an American ecologist. But I think the next couple of decades as we move forward before we get to the, quote unquote space race, what we actually see is that our understanding of structure and ecology is beginning to build piece by piece. Each study, each monograph are building blocks that are bringing in a broader understanding of structure and of complexity. But what it is still kind of in this vein, which has been pejoratively called boutique science. The ecologists and the researchers here are limited in their scope and in their perspective. Often, many of the pieces that we see during the 50s and early 60s are focused on one site. So we're getting more data in, and we're getting more perspective, but it's still limited in scope, which makes sense. At the time, they're constrained by where they can work. If you have a field site nearby, that's what you're going to have. That's why some of the jokes about limnology has always been that it's the study of inland lakes located near large research universities. Ecologists tend to do what they know and tend to do what is available. And that's not wrong. This is just kind of building in this process. But as the century grew on and technology progressed, technology was increasingly applied to the study of ecology and forestry in particular. And this gave us ever-progressing means to look at the environment and how it varies in space. Well, the first half of the century was devoted to time and understanding structure as an outcome. The last half of the century, in the past 70 years or so, we've started to look across space and understand structure as a process in and of itself, continually evolving. So we see this borne out in the literature too. So similar textual analysis, where I picked 3 of the highest cited papers focusing on forest structure since 2000, shows striking differences. The biggest differences that pop out is we have words like spatial, words like data, and we have the inclusion of various remote sensing technologies. This, of course, makes sense. These technologies didn't exist in the first half of the century. But we're beginning to get this focus on space as well as time. This makes sense, right? We're moving this idea from counting stems to individual photons. We're expanding and changing our perspective, allowing increasingly greater views of the extent of the Earth and how our ecosystems is structured. We're also getting increasingly finer views inward, down even to the structure of individual atoms. For us ecologists, specifically those focused on structure, we're beginning to grapple with the complexity of structure, as we are now no longer limited by data, but rather by the time and the ability to make sense of that data, which brings in complexity as the new frontier. In fact, since 1990, there has been a 5-fold increase in the proportion of forest ecology-focused manuscripts that are considering and explicitly focusing on, or at least including complexity as one metric. We even see this in our changing definitions of structure. McIlhenny basically is a compendium of a lot of Franklin's work, defines structure as referring to the spatial arrangement of the various components of the ecosystem, such that the heights of different canopy levels and the spacing of trees. So here we're explicitly bringing in space and arrangement into the definition of structure. So McIlhenny boils this down a little bit more. It says that there's 2 components that create structure. There's structural attributes, which include things like the abundance of trees, how big they are, so big and large trees. Things like relative abundance, which includes foliar height and DBH, basal area, diversity measures, so kind of like derived measures. Richness, so just counting species. And then including specific measures of variance in here, which is kind of interesting to me, building on that. So we're talking about standard deviation of DBH or CV, how close each tree is. We're specifically beginning to bring in this idea of variance and change from the landscape. He defines structural complexity, though, as essentially how these different structural attributes present and the relative abundance of each of them. But I think of interesting note for this workshop is that he specifically says structural complexity is used in preference to structural diversity because the latter term is ambiguous. Just an interesting note. But there are important caveats, I think, to this. Carney has a very interesting paper from 2008 about different ideas of frameworks and understanding complexity. It has a very salient phrase here that ecologists generally remain faithful to a known method rather than accepting a new protocol. He kind of outlines also that there are limitations to how we understand complexity, or at least considerations that we have to have going forward. Remote sensing methods create huge amounts of data, right? Analyzing and relating these data to other data are non-trivial. They require training, but they also require access to resources. And you have to have the skills and you have to have the ability to be able to work with some of these data. There's also the inherent problem that trees live much longer than we do and much longer than grant cycles do. So that's always a consideration that we have to get into. And each individual study still carries a bias of what is actually measured and how that measure is interpreted. And some of this simply depends on the question that is being asked in any given studies. So we're left with still different workers, different researchers doing different things. And we have to bring that together. Carney brings in a very interesting point of this and kind of sums up something that I think we've been progressing for when we're talking about time and space, is this concept of dimensionality. So in this cartoon, he shows that higher dimensional data, here exhibited on the left, are these 3D cones representing tree volumes, or this 3D graph representing some type of gradient over space or time. These can always be moved down to, coarser resolution, right? And then so the question always comes up, of course, I want as much data as I can possibly have, right? More data is always better. But is that really the case? And sometimes singular data points, represented by these 1D measures, if you're thinking about ecological modeling, maybe what you actually need. You just need a better one-dimensional measure. And sometimes three-dimensional data may be what you need. So it's always finding this balance, right, of what you actually need between the less complex to the more complex of your data on complexity. So as you can tell, pandemic, I've been locked in a lot. And so we can kind of think about this, kind of half joking in a way of how trees are represented in video games. The very less complex on the very far side of Super Mario Brothers has these simple, 8-bit pixel trees scrolling side to side. On the very far extreme of this is how many trees and forests are rendered in video games now. They're very high resolution. In some cases, you would almost kind of have to blink to even see if you're not in a real forest. Games like Skyrim or some of the others are very, very realistic in their renderings. And sometimes there's this middle space, which, my kids and I have been playing a lot of, which is Minecraft. Where along this, this gradient is what you actually need. So, we're still going to be driven by questions. And so to get to that, I decided to crowdsource questions out to people on Twitter and ask them, why do you think it's important to study forest and understand structure in the first place? And I got a lot of really good answers on this. And so guiding this, I started to pick some to kind of focus on recent research where that is addressing these questions and kind of building a way that we can think moving forward from that. And I think it's only fitting that we start where we started this talk, thinking about succession. So forest complexity builds from succession, right? Like it takes time to kind of understand how structure and complexity develops. And so some of the work from the early part of the century from Jess Parker and Mary Russ, using, this is when Lidar, or light detection and ranging, was relatively new. They were using this laser rangefinder attached to a kind of a small helicopter that was flying over the forest. It's basically a rangefinder, right? It's shooting out pulses, measuring the distance back. This laser altimetry, as it's called. So what they did was they flew around the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, adjacent forests, and kind of the coastal Maryland region there. It's a very large forest, 30, 40 meter tall, really impressive. And so they scanned some young forests, some forests in kind of the intermediate phase, and kind of mature, and then even up to these large old growth forests. And so these are represented here on the right by these hit grids. And so the y-axis for each is moving from 0 to 40 is your distance above ground. And then these are actually transects cut out from the data. So the one on the x-axis is actually these moving across the transect. So these are kind of individual slices from the canopy. And you can see young forest, very small, kind of uniform canopy, outer surface. The intermediate starts to get a little bumpier. The mature more so, and the old growth is really, really kind of bumpy. So from this data, they formed that there's kind of two general phases in canopy development with succession. One, a period of expansion, where the elevation of the canopy kind of moves up slowly, but there's no elaboration, right? So there's no evolution in the variance of that canopy. And then finally move to a period of erosion, a decline in maximum height and an increase in complexity. This comes from gaps created by the death of overstory trees. From this, they derived a measure called rugosity, which comes from actually the coral reef community and some other areas measuring outer surface roughness. And so what they did was they did the standard deviation of the laser return distances along this. So a higher standard deviation is a more complex canopy. So we see this data in other places as well here. So we're comparing this old growth forest in Maryland to some data from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Similar data here. This is from a ground-based LiDAR unit showing the distribution of vegetation through the canopy. We see this kind of bumpy outer surface area. So this tracks on to existing ideas that have been done in the forestry for a while. This idea of drawing cross sections of the forest, showing how things develop over time. There's some images of this Franklin and Van Pelt manuscript from actually the same year, from 2004, showing these old Douglas fir forests and the old growth ponderosa pines out west. We see this. We have this eastern forest, temperate forest on the left, And then these drawings and depictions of this forest on the right, we see this similar process, right? Older forests kind of tend to be more ragged. One of the things we can do with this, as Fikowski shows in this paper from 2009, is that we can take the LiDAR data, in this case, we're looking at aerial LiDAR again, and use these to build classification models on the landscape so we can know where older forests are, where younger forests are. In this paper, what they did was they basically made 2 training classes based on either the canopy height, so they're looking at older forests are of course a little taller, but they have more variance. Younger forests are shorter, but they have less variance. And they also included cover in this, right? So that's kind of adding an additional axis of variation, changing the dimensionality, similar to the Carney approach, right? And so from that, they're able to take this and do across the landscape in more 3 dimensions, then boil that 3 dimensions on the left through a classification model down to 2D data that shows us where old growth forest is, where kind of intermediate forests are, where young forests are in the landscape. So what's actually happening during the period of succession? Here we're again looking at wind forest experimental forest, Wind River experimental forest, if I can get that right. So a similar large western forest, this time in Oregon, is that these old growth forests have this variation in age classes. Basically, as trees die, other trees kind of fill in the gaps in this. So when we start to look at this and moving from the actual trees into data, here we have what are called hypsogryphs. I've never been able to say it. We always say canopy profiles at this point, where it's actually showing you kind of like the change, like where 100% of the height is, like where height decays in the forest, right? So by the time you get to the top of this, you have no more vegetation there. It's kind of the percent of vegetation below that point. So what's kind of interesting from this is you can build, and this is the take-home picture, I think, from this Levski manuscript on LiDAR early on, is what he's done is showing this kind of 2D profile of the canopy, show you where the open gap space occurs. You can see it here in this very light gray at top. And then you move into an area of very high light, this euphotic zone, right? So we can see kind of how the light environment changes moving down through the canopy to eventually get to this oligotrophic or light limited zone, and eventually to a closed gap space in the canopy. Using LiDAR, we're able to kind of show how succession has created this environment over time. We can kind of imagine that, how this would change based on the LiDAR profiles of younger and different age canopies. In 3 dimensions, we still see this kind of roughness. So this is actually from that similar Franklin and Ben Pelt, where I showed you the cross sections earlier. Here they're showing LiDAR data across the canopy, where you can see this peaks and the trees. You can see that this old growth forest here, it's a 500-year-old forest. It's very rough, it's very ragged, right? Succession builds complexity. However, there are some caveats to this. As older forests aren't necessarily complex, we have to consider biological complexity in this as well. So I'm showing you data here from 300-year-old stands at Huron Mountain Club. This comes from some, I think, unpublished data. And it's from Stovall and also from Bob Fahey and Kerry Woods. On the left, we have a sugar maple stand. On the right, we have eastern hemlock. So again, they're similar age. They develop in similar areas, but the sugar maple stand is a more complex forest than the eastern hemlock. And this is indicated by that measure of rugosity. So you see it's a little bit higher there below than it is for the hemlock. Point of note, whereas Parker and Russ are showing you that top rugosity measure, I'm actually showing you canopy rugosity, which differs in a little because instead of being the standard deviation of heights, this is more of a product of both the horizontal and vertical variance, so kind of an internal canopy arrangement. The eastern hemlock forest down on the right is less complex because there's no layering. It's shaded out trees beneath it. So there's kind of this axis of biological complexity. It's very interesting to note. So in this paper recently from Hastings et al. Shows why this can be an issue on the landscape. So on the left here, we have differences from, this is NASA G-Light data, so a waveform LiDAR, which is a little bit different, and showing differences in structure beneath a broadleaf forest on the left and then a conifer forest on the right. Why this can be really informative is because here on the right, what we're seeing are these canopy delineation models. It's really a big axis of research and wanting to do take structural data and do automatic or automated canopy delineation, see where the individuals are in the landscape. However, conifer trees grow differently than broadleaf trees, and this introduces some level of error axis, or some axis of error. So into this, what we have to do is we can bring in additional trait data necessarily, or maybe additional data forms. This idea of fusing data, we can actually inform this a little bit better. Next question that kind of came up that people seem to be very interested in is the idea of structure and how it relates to function. So old forests are important to us for a lot of reasons. Succession is still a major focus because of the intrinsic role it plays in forest function. As forests grow, they tend to sequester more carbon. Birdsey et al. 2006, in this panel to the left here, shows that there's more forest carbon sequestered in standing biomass in older forests. In a review of the role of forest structure in this, Curtis and Goff detail that as forests age, their productivity may tend to slow, but it doesn't necessarily become zero or negative, right? So the old forests are still maybe not as productive as they were when they were younger, but partially due to the fact that they're more complex, they're actually sustaining and still bringing in carbon. Curtis and Goff say this is in part due to the leaf area structure of a forest as it ages, right? So it may retain the same leaf area actually. So it may have the same amount of photosynthetic material, but it actually changes and makes that more efficient over time due to physical complexity and the biological complexity. In turn, this translates into more resource use efficient forest. So this is borne out in actual data as well. So this is a review from Goff et al. In 2019 in Ecology of a lot of temperate forest sites in the NEON data set. And so we can see here in green are these measures of structural complexity, and this in purple here are measures of species diversity. And these are all regressed against net primary productivity, growth based on wood accrued in trees, right? So basically just wood growth. And what we see is that more complex sites are more productive. But interestingly, some of the relationships between species diversity and productivity are not even significant. Complexity is actually more strongly correlated than biological diversity to measures of productivity. This is kind of interesting to know. When we look at actual data on resource acquisition and resource efficiency, here on the left we have FPAR data, which is basically just how much light a canopy is absorbing against that measure of rugosity, so that measure of complexity. And these are for those same NEON data sites. We see that up here at the top, the GRSM, Great Smoky Mountains, which is a more complex site. Also, Smithsonian Conservation Biological Institute, these big complex forests absorb more light compared to, in this case, our far outlier, as Ordway Swisher, is an open pine savanna. There's less complex canopy, there's just less canopy, it's less is able to absorb light. So this kind of proves in a way some work earlier last decade from Hardiman et al. Showing that more complex canopies, and this is based on light use efficiency and nitrogen use efficiency, are simply more efficient. So they can acquire more resources. And based on efficiency, which is a unit of tree per unit of resource, they can use it more efficiently. We're also beginning to see, and this is a kind of a complex graph from Smith et al. Based on the Amazon basin, showing these are canopy height profiles. And what you see is that these profiles actually can change over time. And so these are seeing these kind of responses in these evergreen systems to changes in drought and changes in, or in El Nino in this case. So within these forests in the Amazon, we actually can see that canopies respond and they're dynamic to changes in the environment. So they can mediate their structure to retain their functionality. They saw that LAI may have decreased during the dry season, or increased during the dry season rather, but would decrease following the onset of the wet season. The upper canopy would gain leaf area during the dry season, but the lower canopy would lose leaf area. So actually different areas of the canopy are changing in response to the environment. But there was also this question about habitat. which admittedly, I am not as skilled or as knowledgeable in. And so I have to go back to the originator here. A lot of our work that, that I do actually stems from Robert MacArthur going out and measuring trees in the late 60s. And he did that because he was interested in birds. And so he was one of the first mathematical ecologists. He brought a very elegant, sophisticated approach to connecting habitat and structure. So here he's showing breeding bird census data from Puerto Rico and Panama and some temperate forests in the US. And on the left, he has basically a variance in the frequency of bird species and their habitats plotted against this foliar height diversity difference. So a difference in foliar height diversity. So really kind of putting a variance against a variance. And as foliar height diversity kind of increases, you see this concurrent increase in kind of the diversity of bird habitats. More variable canopy in forest equals more habitat for the birds. So they're able basically just to host more species. There's more niches available, therefore can kind of host more bird species. So we built on this obviously since the 60s, and from Lidar data here from this excuse me, I've lost my citation here, but this is Lidar data from here we go. Yes, from Verlian et al. In Frontiers in Ecology and Environment in 2008, showing Lidar transects you can cut out, and you can actually kind of identify differences in the landscape. And so some people are taking this and translating it into habitat models for animals. Here on the right, this is Lidar data from Nez Perce Forest or Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. And so at the top, we see a landscape image, taking ortho imagery, combining with Lidar. And what they're doing is they're looking for instances of horizontal cover. And then at the bottom, the landscape level here, or at the stand level rather. So they're taking Lidar data, figuring out where the gaps are in the forest, and figuring out where the more enclosed area of the forest are, and rating that on a scale of 0 to 1, and using that to forecast where cover habitat exists for Canada lynx. So taking the structural data and then boiling it down into something that can then be used to forecast habitat. Similar like an evolution of what MacArthur was doing in the 60s, and then using that to inform management decisions. Structural complexity also, though, really touches on disturbance. So I'm going to show you some here. This is data from Harvard Forest, particularly the Forest Geo Large Hemlock plot, which began to be infested by hemlock woolly adelgid in 2010. So on the left, I'm showing you NDVI image. There's difference in NDVI from 2010 to 2016. So anywhere that's green actually greened up over those 6 years. Anywhere that's black did not, sort of browned up. And then on the right, we actually have the stand level data. So each individual dot is a hemlock, or most of them are hemlocks, some of them are some other trees. When they're circled in red, that means they died sometime during that period. So what we can see when we start to look at Lidar data along transects within this is that over the course of this time, high mortality areas are actually losing complexity, whereas low mortality areas have yet to lose that complexity. They're retaining that complexity. Kind of in part, though, this has to do with how woolly adelgid kills a tree. It moves from the inside out and slowly defoliates it, and eventually killing it. So we know that different disturbances affect different structural aspects of a canopy. So this is kind of a busy plot here. This is a radar graph showing different axes of structure, particularly focusing on leaf area, area density, height, and arrangement, complexity, and openness. Let me see. Go ahead and cut this. Hope I can edit this. If not, we'll go back there. Okay. All right. So 34. But then another question comes up of why we study structure. In a way, it's simply because we're trying to make sense of the environment that's around us. We need, moving forward, to take the structural complexity ideas or structural diversity, whatever it is that we want to arrive at, and we need to do something with them. There's something to be said for just a basic understanding of how the environment is built and how it works, but also we need to turn that in, to science, to management, to actual things that we can do with and move forward with. And there's been a lot of work in this area coming from different angles. So this is from Hans Verbeek and a group trying to build, an idea of structural complexity. And they're actually doing it from the individual level. And they're doing it within the framework of the leaf economic spectrum or wood economic spectrum. So, kind of at the top, they've taken several hundred scans of individual trees from terrestrial Lidar. And from this, built these ideas of there's just a handful of ways to build trees. And you take those individual trees and you can kind of plug them into this model that there's a structural spectrum, right? That there's a couple of axes of variation, whether it be the aspect, the crown depth to the tree height, or the density of the crown, or even kind of how the actual vertical construction of this is. The spectrum can then be used to kind of infer some measure of function that we care about, because there's only so many ways you can build a forest. Similar work in temperate forest from Fahey et al., shown here from 2019. There's an additional approach here where they're actually looking at plot and stand level data of just LiDAR. So not individual trees, but rather the forest as a whole, showing that there's axes of both vertical complexity and horizontal complexity. And that different forests kind of fit within this matrix, kind of a low vertical complexity, low horizontal complexity. You have single layer systems, even, prairie grass systems fit into this. As you move up in both axes, you begin to get these tall, dense, single layered forests, maybe like a plantation forest or a managed forest, right? And then kind of more at the other extremes of this, you get these multi-layered, patchy, mature forests, similar to those old growth forests that we have. There's kind of a framework where different forests can fit into this, right? Other approaches to this, and this paper actually just came out like Friday or Saturday, and I just got a copy of it last night, so I haven't really got to dig into it too much, but one et al., and they're using basically everything they can throw at is to build this idea of aggregating data. So they're actually working with JEDI data, which is the NASA waveform sensor that's on the ISS. They're also throwing in airborne data, throwing in some UAV data. There's a couple of terrestrial sites or terrestrial-based LiDAR systems in this. And what they're trying to do is, similar to Verbeek, similar to Fahey, build this idea that there's different ways that we can build in a range of forest. From this, we have low to high height, we have changes in cover, and we have differences in structural complexity. We can combine this with other observations, other data sources, this idea of fusing data, and from that we can really build an understanding of our environment and use structural complexity to inform questions that we care about, measuring primary productivity, understanding habitat structure, understanding composition and biodiversity, population abundance. These are the things that we want to get to. Structural complexity is an improvement on what we had and a means to that end. So with that, I would say, wrapping up, that our views on structure and complexity are always products of our perspective. This includes not only our technical abilities, but also we have to consider our own biases and backgrounds, including the privilege and access, maybe where we study, how we got there, and also the schools of thought that we were even trained in. That's going to inform us. Again, ecologists are creatures of habit. Science is not unbiased, and there's no reason to believe that ecology is any different. But this, however, can be our starting point. It doesn't have to be our destination. Our science is always and will be shaped by technology. But with this progress, we have expanded our scope, and we may have built new ways to see and understand the world. It is always important to remember that technology is a tool. Whether we're doing classic hypothesis or descriptive-driven research, even if there is a difference, we should always be guided by questions and theory. There's no definition that we have yet of what really structural complexity or diversity is. We don't all agree. I think the final 3 slides is kind of going through that there's people grappling with framework of how do we bring all this together. It just kind of shows that we're progressing towards that. And that's important. The next decade or so is going to be guided by this research and guided by this framework. Within this talk, I didn't give anywhere near the number of examples of how structural complexity is informing ecological research that there are. And I hope, though, it shows you a breadth of where it can go. But I think, to recognize my own bias here, I want to skip by it, close with a quote from one of Jerry Franklin's papers, which includes Hank Schugert, who was my introduction and indoctrination into forest ecology. The knowledge of the ecology and natural history of individual species and ecosystems is essential for understanding and predicting what will occur in forest. In this workshop, we're going to be talking about bringing together a lot of different things here for a couple of days. That's very exciting. And we do it by building on what has come before us and improving on it without losing sight of context. And whether that be bias, perspective, privilege, or understanding of technology, we're building on things, and this is going to help shape that forward. So with that, thank you.